So good evening and welcome. I'm Evan DeLucia. I'm a professor in the Department of Plant Biology, and I also serve as the Baum Family Director for our campus's Institute for Sustainability, Energy, and Environment. The Institute is your host over the next few days for iSEE Congress 2018. For the fifth year in a row, iSEE has gathered leading national and international experts from different disciplines, different organizations, governmental and non-governmental organizations, and industry leaders to discuss a particular facet of sustainability, energy, and environment. This year's topic, Sustainable Cities, we're going to hit on all three. But before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Robert Jones, our Chancellor here at the University of Illinois, to make a few welcoming remarks. Dr. Jones?
Well, good afternoon to everyone. Now, those of you that know me know I don't tolerate that kind of warm response. I'm a Southerner, and I fundamentally believe in the principle of call and response, and so when I call, you're supposed to respond with the enthusiasm that is commensurate with this important event. So, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. That is much better, class. I certainly appreciate it. It is my pleasure and honor to welcome all of you to this fifth annual iSEE Congress, and I have to say at the forefront that as both the chancellor of this amazing University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and as a plant physiologist, plant scientist, I think some of you know I spent the better part of my career working to improve the production of important agricultural crops in the face of global climate change. So this annual Congress is of particular interest and importance to me, both professionally and personally. I want to congratulate Evan and all of the faculty and staff affiliated with the Institute on Sustainability, Energy, and the Environment for assembling this body of scholars, policymakers, community, and industrial leaders around the theme of climate change and resilience. Back in 2012, this entire campus went through a very thoughtful, deep, and deliberate collaborative strategic planning process. And one of the things I might add is that we take strategic planning very seriously at this university. Been around higher education for about 40 plus years now. And I know far too often I've had to participate in strategic planning for strategic planning's sake. And what I mean by that, it was one of those administrative boxes that administrators had to check every 5 years or so. And a lot more often than not, those strategic plans didn't lead to much. But that effort back in 2012 identified a series of grand societal challenges where the university could and must and should play a distinctive role in developing solutions in the next 50 years. Energy, sustainability, and environment emerged as the top of the list, and iSEE was conceived as a way of leveraging the vast campus-wide resource and expertise in this area. So standing here today, just 6 years removed from that concept, I want to publicly thank and recognize iSEE as one of the biggest success stories in this university's history, and definitely one of the best success stories that grew out of that strategic planning process. So let's give Evan and his entire team a round of applause. And if you've heard me speak at all, you're also very likely to have heard me state my belief that the most powerful tool that universities like ours possess is our ability to convene individuals, organizations, institutions, and agencies and community around critically important societal issues. This Congress and the 300, I understand now more than 400 people who will be taking part in this discussion and dialogue over the next 2 days, or a very clear demonstration of what the power of convening looks like in real time. Given the global movement towards more and larger urban centers, developing effective and scalable approaches to more sustainable cities is clearly an important imperative. Our cities are not just population centers and engineering projects and massive built environments. They are now world-shaping intersection of every critical issue, from human health to global warming, to food and energy stability, water insecurity, politics, and religion. And with the ever-expanding global population, it is simply no denying what I heard Bruce Katz talk about more than a decade ago, that we are truly living in an urban age. Our cities are going to get bigger. They're going to demand and stress the growth that puts our planet ecologically and societal systems. It's going to challenge all those systems, and we must find a systematic way of addressing those concerns. We certainly need resilient cities if we're going to have a resilient future for all of us. So it's my great honor and pleasure to thank you all for coming this afternoon and for engaging in this critical conversation over the next days that's going to help chart a better future for us all. So on behalf of the entire university community, welcome to the iSEE Congress. Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Well, thank you so much, Chancellor Jones. We're really excited to start this year's conversation. So cities are enormously attractive as centers of economic and cultural activity, but they're also extraordinarily large consumers of energy, water, sources of solid waste, air pollution, and greenhouse gas emissions across the world. They're hotbeds for poor air quality, congestion, densified housing, and they are vulnerable to the extreme damages to life and infrastructure due to severe temperature and weather events, as we've seen in the news just this past week. So what are the next steps for making people and the environment safer as we meet the ever-growing city population's needs for food, water, energy, transportation, housing, and more? How do we do that economically and without major impact on our environment? We know that expanding green space, permeable surfaces, disaster-resistant, resilient infrastructure, cities can emit fewer emissions, thereby benefiting human health and weather. We know that urban consumption patterns are being transformed by the emergence of ride-sharing programs, e-commerce, smartphone-enabled connectivity, and demand for green infrastructure. How do we best employ new infrastructure and technology to secure a better future? This conference is intended to provide an open forum for scientific presentation, enlightenment, and debate, and we hope that will help form partnerships and identify new research avenues for us going forward, and identify actionable solutions to some of the challenges that we face. This week we have 24 experts, as well as municipal and government panel, gathered here at the Illini Union, near the heart of our two cities, to discuss these questions and more. I'm really excited to hear what they have to say. To kick off our discussion and to get you thinking about the big picture at iSEE Congress 2018, it is my pleasure to introduce you tonight keynote speaker, Dr. Garrett Knapp. Dr. Knapp is an expert in economics and urban policy, and specifically the concept of smart growth planning for more sustainable cities. His research interests include the interactions between housing markets and policy, the economics and politics of land use planning, the efficacy of economic development instruments, and the impacts of environmental policy. On these subjects, he's authored over 65 publications and has co-authored or co-edited over 9 books. He is Professor of Urban Studies and Planning and Executive Director of the National Center for Smart Growth Research at the University of Maryland. I might add that he is a former professor here in our own Department of Urban and Regional Planning. Thank you for coming home to us. He earned his BS from Willamette University and an MA and PhD from the University of Oregon, and received postdoctoral training from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, all in economics. He received the Chester Rapkin Award for Best Paper published in the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research, and he received the 1998 Best of ACSP Award. In 2006, he received the Outstanding Planner Award from the Maryland chapter of the American Planning Association. He currently serves on the State of Maryland Smart Growth Subcabinet, Sustainable Growth Commission, Governor's Scientific Advisory Panel, and the Mitigation and Scientific Work Groups of the Climate Commission. Today, he's here to present From Smart Growth to Sustainable Cities, What Have We Learned? It's been nearly 2 decades since the principles of smart growth were developed, and Dr. Knapp will share his insights into where we started with the sustainable city concept, where we are now, and where we are headed. Please join me in giving Dr. Knapp a warm welcome to the podium.
See if I can change the PowerPoint. Are we on? Great. So thank you so much for that warm introduction. I can tell you that it's great to be back. So it's great to be back, but it's great when the slides advance. So my slides are advancing. Well, they're advancing on my screen, but not on your screen. I can give a great talk to myself this way. But you're going to see one slide. Any help? My slides are advancing, but I can't find the cursor. I think I just need to go to show mode here.
I'm a Mac guy, so I'm gonna...
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, me too. 3 Mac guys up here trying to fix this.
I don't have the cursor.
Yeah, I'm not seeing the cursor either. All right, now, I think I just had to hit escape now, see if it'll advance. Oh,
We
now
got
we're
the
on.
other.
Not escape my attention that not the chancellor, not myself, Dr. Knapp, who's very hard to do.
Yes. And all else fails, pander to the crowd.
All right. Try it now. Try presenter mode.
We good?
I hope.
Yes. So, thank you. So first of all, it's great to be back, right? These photos are pictures of me in the Department of Urban Planning a few years ago. And I'm standing next to my first PhD student ever with a couple of staff members in the image on the left. And on the right, I'm sitting at a graduation event with 2 former colleagues, Len Heumann and Clyde Forrest, who's no longer with us. And there I am, I think in the same suit, actually, right? Only 30 pounds lighter, right, and a lot more hair. And for those of you who know Lou Hopkins, he looks exactly the same today as he does in that picture. So it's terrific to be back. One of the things I really liked about being in Champaign-Urbana was the opportunity to engage in lots of physical exercise and activities. So I would swim at Windsor pool in the morning and play noon ball at MP at noon, and some of you I think know this reference, right? And play tennis at Atkins, play doubles in the evening. And Now I don't get to do that anymore. So the only exercise I get to do now really is take long walks with my dog. And when I'm walking the dog, I listen to Pandora. Y'all know Pandora? Right? So Pandora is a radio station that tries to personalize the music for you, as well as the ads, right? So if you're a young person, you get ads about all the hip and trendy things going on. And if you're a rich person, you get ads for, fancy trips and cars. But for some reason, Pandora's targeted me for the elder care and the memory therapy, right? So if I start to lose it during this presentation, you'll know that Pandora was right. So here we go. So there was a great introduction already from the Chancellor and the Director about the importance of cities. And I don't think I have to tell you about the importance of cities. It's where all the jobs are, it's where all the people live, it's where all the source of the greenhouse gases and economic productivity and so forth. Right? So what are we going to do about our cities? So I'm going to talk about sprawl and smart growth, right, which is an early and ongoing attempt to address sustainable cities. I'll talk about what we've learned from 20 years of smart growth. I'll talk then about sustainable cities and talk somewhat about scenario analysis, which is some work that we're doing at the National Center to address sustainability and try to come up with more sustainable policies. So, you can't talk about smart growth without talking about urban sprawl. I presume you all know the term urban sprawl, and everybody's got their own definition of urban sprawl. Here's one: the rapid expansion of geographic extent of cities and towns, often characterized by low-density development, single-use zoning, and extensive reliance on the private automobile. So this is one general definition of urban sprawl. I would say that if there's one area in which the science of urban planning and smart growth has advanced the most, it's in the ability to measure urban form and urban sprawl. So now we can not only get detailed measures of land use and mixtures of land use and contiguity and land use patterns, we can measure the road network and its connectivity, we can measure the impervious surface, we can measure the density of development, the types of housing. And so unlike a pornography, which is said to be recognizable when you see it, we can actually measure urban sprawl, and we can adopt policies that address this question and identify the very specific impacts of urban sprawl. So as I was preparing this presentation, I went back to some of the old slides that Deanna may remember from way back when we were trying to address this issue 20 years ago, and I found this slide, which looks at urbanized land patterns from 1960 to 1990. This is somewhat dated, obviously, but it's illustrating for some central Illinois cities how much the land area had grown from 1960 to 1990 and how much the population had grown. And you can see that in every central Illinois city that the area had grown much more rapidly than the population. And I don't know what the current data are. I'm sure my colleagues in the urban planning program know this, but I would doubt that that has changed very much. And so obviously if you've got the area growing faster than the population, you've got densities falling, right? And so density being one central measure of urban sprawl, this is a problem. So what is smart growth then? Smart growth covers a range of development and conservation strategies that protect our health and natural environment, make our communities more attractive, economically stronger, and more socially diverse. This is a definition from the US EPA. The simple way to think about smart growth is the antidote to urban sprawl. It is the term used by a lot of people to suggest more progressive strategies that will help to mitigate the problem of urban sprawl. So where did smart growth come from? In a paper I had written some time ago, I described the origins of urban sprawl to come essentially from three sources: from Washington, D.C., from Chicago, Illinois, and from the state of Maryland. So first from Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C., as you may know, is a home of a lot of lobbyists and advocates. And there was an advocacy organization created in the mid-1990s around the authorization of the transportation bill called the Surface Transportation Policy Group. This advocacy organization eventually became Smart Growth America. So many of the principles and ideas of smart growth as an antidote to urban sprawl are not new ideas, but in the mid-1990s, there began to develop advocacy organizations that promoted this idea. The whole term urban sprawl, smart growth, is suggestive of the opposite of dumb growth. This is a political strategy to try to get public support for this battle to address urban sprawl. So Washington, D.C. was one source. The second source is Chicago. Chicago, as you may know, is the home of the American Planning Association. And in the early 1990s, the American Planning Association launched an effort to create a legislative guidebook called Growing Smart. And I actually worked on this when I was on sabbatical from the University of Illinois. And the idea of the legislative guidebook was to provide guidance to state legislatures for how to adopt policies that would result in more progressive and smarter growth. The main idea here being institutional change. The notion that our existing patterns of land use can be explained partly by our existing patterns of governance, and that if we leave planning entirely to local governments, that we're going to end up with urban sprawl no matter what we do. So the idea behind the legislative guidebook was to provide greater state oversight and greater state leadership in addressing land use problems. The third source is the state of Maryland, which is why the National Center for Smart Growth now sits at the University of Maryland. In 1997, the state of Maryland passed the Smart Growth Neighborhood Conservation Act. This is a picture of Governor Glendening signing that act. The idea behind this act was not only to address urban sprawl and promulgate smart growth, but to use incentives rather than regulations as an implementation strategy. So whereas the state of Oregon, which is probably the pioneer in this effort, adopted a lot of regulatory strategies, growth boundaries, zoning, exclusive farm use, and so forth, the state of Maryland thought that it had figured out a way by which the state could incentivize local governments to behave in a more progressive way and address land use in a more progressive fashion. So these three sources led to three distinct elements in the origins of smart growth. So in part, in fact, in large, from this smart growth advocacy organization and its advocacy roots came these 10 principles of smart growth. And these 10 principles have been around now for a long time and were heavily promoted at one point, although not so much promoted anymore. The first is mixed land uses. One of the characterizing features of urban sprawl is the separation of land uses, where you have residential areas in one part of the city and commercial areas in another part of the city, and there's no way you could get from the residential areas to the commercial areas without getting in your car and driving. So the idea behind smart growth was to mix land uses and make sure that there are residents and commercial activities in the same place so you wouldn't have to drive from one place to the other. The second is promote compact building design, both at the building scale as well as the urban scale. If we can build more compactly, things will be closer to each other, and we'll have an intensity of activity that makes for a much more vibrant urban environment, as well as, again, less dependency on the automobile. The third is create a range of housing choices and opportunities. If you look at the suburban countryside across most of this country, you'll see a lot of pretty homogeneous single-family development on large lots. So if we can follow strategies and implement strategies that provided a mix of housing types, towns, duplexes, garden apartments, high-density residential areas, that we would have the possibility to prevent some of that expansion on the urban fringe and have more development in the urban core. The fourth is build walkable neighborhoods. We've discovered that if people spend all their time in cars, they have little time to do anything else. It leads to greater vehicle miles traveled as well as greenhouse gases. If we can build communities where people can walk to work or walk to the store and buy a loaf of bread or walk to a civic activity, that those kind of neighborhoods are places then that people perhaps wouldn't have to drive their car and wouldn't want to live on the periphery. The fifth is create distinctive and attractive communities with a strong sense of place. If you're going to build compactly, if you're going to expect people to want to live in dense environments, they have to be high-quality environments. And they got to be quality environments where people feel like there's a there there. Through advances in urban design, the idea was to create distinctive places where people would actually have a there there and want to be there. The sixth is preserve farmland and open space and natural resources. This is a natural corollary to the build more compactly. The seventh is strengthen and direct development toward existing communities. So rather than pillage and move on, go back to the places that we built once before and redevelop. The idea being, again, that If you can save on building new roads and new sewer systems and build where those systems already exist, so you can save money and foster more vibrant communities. The seventh, eighth, I got no numbers on these. I should put numbers on these. The eighth is provide a variety of transportation choices. Don't force everyone to drive a car, right? Provide transit, provide buses, provide bike lanes, provide pedestrian environments, sidewalks, so that people have a choice of how to transport themselves. The ninth is make development decisions predictable, fair, and effective. One of the major impediments to urban redevelopment and building within cities is the regulatory environment, which makes it very difficult to develop in those places. And the 10th is encourage community and stakeholder collaboration in development decisions, the standard recommendation that we always support in the planning profession is to encourage citizen participation. So these were the 10 principles of smart growth that were elaborated in the early 1990s and have been sort of carried over for these past 20 years. One way to look at this in a different way is to think about the implementation of smart growth at multiple regional scales. So we can think about smart growth at the regional scale or metropolitan scale, we can think about it at the community scale, and we can think about it at the street scale. So Portland, as you probably know, has long been on the forefront of smart growth and sustainable development. This is a map from the 2040 concept plan. You can see that it has a very distinct boundary around the metropolitan area, its famous urban growth boundary. Inside the boundary is where the development goes. Outside the boundary is where development is prohibited. Everything outside the boundary is zoned exclusively for farm or forest use. So you have this very clear distinction between urban and rural uses. You have a polycentric hierarchy of places. So you've got big dots and littler dots that characterize different places and different place types, as I'll elaborate on in a moment. You can see sort of in yellow, dark yellow, light rail system, which goes both north-south and east-west. And you can see connectivity of roads that connect all these nodes together. So each of those nodes in the hierarchy has a separate function. Downtown is where you want to put, to do my best Marco Rubio here, lean over and drink water. Where you put the metropolitan-wide functions. This is where you want the density, the most dense place. You want mixed uses. This needs to be the focus of the transit system because this is where you want most of the jobs to be. The suburban centers, which are the next level in the urban hierarchy. These are places that are also relatively dense, once again mixed use and connected to the neighborhoods, certainly connected by transit, but not the central focus of the transit system. The next level node are the transit stations. Right? These are places that are, again, intended to be mixed use and walkable and connected to the neighborhoods in which they lie. And then there are the single-family neighborhoods. I think the genius of the Portland plan was to preserve the single-family neighborhoods. If you come out with a strategy that suggests that what you want to do is make everything mixed-use, high-density, walkable, you'll get resistance, and you won't find a political majority to make that viable. So one of the things that Portland did was create places where smart growth was viable. Think about this carefully in terms of what you want at each of those nodes, but don't impose on the folks who clearly choose and insist on living in a single-family suburban lifestyle. And then, of course, you got the connectors, right? The road networks, the transit systems, or what we're now calling complete streets. Right? Complete streets are streets that not only carry automobile traffic, but they have the bike lanes, they have the transit systems, they have the sidewalks, and they provide accessibility for multiple modes of transportation and not just the automobile. So another way to look at this question or this distinction between smart growth and urban sprawl is in this diagram. One of the points of this diagram I think that is most important is that it's not all about density. The density of housing and activity in the upper part of this diagram is exactly the same as the density in the lower part of this diagram. But one of these is more characteristics of sprawl, and one of them is more characteristic of smart growth. Right? And I've labeled them for you so there's no confusion. Right? So what's wrong with the sprawl scenario? Well, you've got clear separation of uses. You've got the single-family neighborhood, all with winding streets that are not interconnected. You've got the multifamily in the middle, and you've got the mall on the left. And notice you can't get from any one of those uses to one of those other uses without getting on that arterial, right? Which makes that arterial heavily congested. Notice that if you live in the single family or you live in the apartments and you want your child to walk to school, there's no way to do that without getting on, once again, that heavily traveled arterial. The parking lot around the mall needs to be large because you have to drive there, right? Which creates a lot of impervious surface. Down below, however, you see that the road network is highly interconnected, so you can get anywhere within that lower half of that diagram much more easily. The single family and the multifamily uses are mixed. You can get to the mall by means other than driving, hence the parking lot can be smaller, and people can walk to school. So this is the community level illustration of sprawl and smart growth. And finally, there's sort of the street level. So contrast, for example, this image here with this one. I mean, where would you rather be? So what's the difference? Well, in this one, you've got open street, focused on the automobile, right, with no pedestrian access. Where here, notice, you've got trees. So you've got green space, you've got shade, protection from the sun, you've got transit that runs down the middle, you've got sidewalks that are protected from the road in part by parking, you've got architecture that is varied and provides a sense of enclosure. So where would you rather be, here or here? And where do you think property values are higher? So these are the general principles of smart growth. We just had a big event at the University of Maryland celebrating the 20th anniversary of smart growth, because remember the governor signed the legislation 20 years ago, and he came and the current governor came, and it was very interesting to have a Democratic governor and a Republican governor in the same place, all celebrating smart growth. So what have we learned? Right? What have you learned about these principles? So first, on the issue of urban form, I think what we've learned is that walkable mixed-use neighborhoods can be designed in ways that create vibrancy and economic success. Anybody recognize this place? Downtown Champaign, right? I don't know if the Blind Pig still exists. Does it still exist? Yeah? Okay, good. Let's go there. But you know, I came back 5 years ago, and downtown Champaign was booming. It was awesome. That was not true 20 years ago, right? So if we're careful and purposeful in designing environments, we can do it. And they become nice places that we want to gather and that you want to perhaps live, although I'm not sure how much people actually live in downtown Champaign. Do people live in downtown Champaign? Yeah, great, great. So more importantly, or as importantly, do residents, or I'm saying residents do, of mixed-use neighborhoods, they tend to drive less, they tend to walk more, and have more social interaction. There's been volumes of research in the planning literature on this. This is one of the most heavily researched areas in the field of urban planning, and certainly in the area of smart growth. So, and you know, it's partly like the economists, we tend to prove the obvious, right? So if you put people in a place that is compact, that has a lot of things you can get to, they're going to walk more, they're going to interact with each other more, and they're going to drive less. And there's been volumes of research now that really shows this. That said, there remains substantial demand for low-density suburban, exurban communities, especially for families with children and pets. It is still true that millennials are attracted to central places like downtown Champaign, but when they have kids, their preferences change. And it's not clear that everybody's going to move to the suburbs, but you know some of them will, and there remains a substantial political constituency for that kind of development pattern. On the housing and urban development front, urban containment and urban revitalization has been difficult to achieve even in progressive cities and states. We've done some looking at some national patterns of development, and I showed you that bar graph for central Illinois about how much population has grown and how much urban areas has grown. This is still happening all over the country. Right? So densities continue to fall. And so even places that have very well-known and aggressive boundary type of tools, it is still true that we are expanding much more at the urban fringe than we are revitalizing the urban core. Development controls are major impediments that limit housing supply and affordability in high opportunity areas. Planners are in part the instrument of the problem. That part of the problem of trying to redevelop and trying to prevent urban sprawl is that our existing land use controls in our currently developed areas are resistant to that type of development. One of the problems with democracy and citizen participation is that nobody wants new development in their neighborhood, right? And until we develop systems that look far enough in front so that the current residents are unable to preclude the next resident from coming in the door, we're going to continue to have this problem. Finally, infill and redevelopment is generally more costly for both public and private sectors. Infill and redevelopment is a critical aspect of smart growth and must be done, but it is not true that it's cheaper, right? The advocates sometimes try to claim, I think, that it would be cheaper to develop in places where the existing infrastructure exists. And while there is elements of truth to that, it almost always requires a retrofitting and tearing down what's already there. So that tends to be much more expensive. And this is, again, one of the major impediments to smarter development patterns. On transportation and land use. So transportation and land use are interrelated and must be planned and managed together. This seems so obvious now, right? You got to do this together. But it wasn't actually obvious 25, 30 years ago. Land use was planned and managed by the planners, and transportation was planned and managed by the engineers, right? And the engineers looked at the existing land use patterns and built roads to accommodate it, and the planners looked at the existing road system and decided where they were going to develop the land, and they rarely talked to each other. So I think we've made a lot of progress on this so that we know that when we plan for new infrastructure, that we plan for land use patterns that are accommodating and complementary to it. Land use policy can be used to reduce vehicle miles traveled and increase transit ridership, but elasticities are low and barriers are high and costly to overcome. So there was a National Academy of Science panel that looked at this question in quite some depth. Rolf Pendel was on that panel. They determined that land use policy indeed can be used to lower vehicle miles traveled, lower greenhouse gases as a result, but it's a heavy lift. That the elasticities, the sensitivity of travel behavior to land use tends to be relatively small. It takes a big change in land use patterns to get a small change in travel behavior, and the difficulty of using land use as a strategy and the political obstacles are significantly high. So the hopes of addressing our vehicle miles traveled, our automobile dependency, and our greenhouse gas strategies using land use alone is going to be a real uphill climb. Finally, I'm an economist. I believe prices matter. So transit fares, fuel taxes, and tolls can have large effects on travel behavior. So whereas the elasticity of travel behavior with respect to land use is relatively low, the elasticity of travel behavior with respect to prices is relatively high. Not only with respect to transit fares, for example, but service levels. One of the things we're working on in Washington, D.C. is to make it possible for you to ride the metro, the bus, the MARC, and all the transit systems and the bike share systems with a single pass. Right now, you can't do that, right? And so if you're going to try to encourage intermodality, you've got to try to make that intermodality much easier, all right? And that's a real problem. So on policy implementation. So there was a famous report in 1971 called The Quiet Revolution in Land Use Control. Right? This report said that what we need is greater state intervention in land use policy. And at the time, there was optimism that that was in fact taking place, and that was termed the Quiet Revolution. It is pretty clear to me and others that the Quiet Revolution is over, and the revolutionaries have lost. Right? We see, even in places like Oregon and Maryland, not we see a stepping back of state intervention in local land use policies rather than growing influence of the state. So that institutional change that I talked about that the APA was promulgating has not happened. The performance of incentives programs like Maryland has been disappointing. We've done a tremendous amount of research on Maryland's program. Remember, I told you that Maryland's program is based largely on incentives, trying to use economic incentives to get development patterns in a more smart fashion. And the effect has been relatively small and quite disappointing, unfortunately. Advancements in planning technology have improved local planning, but the focus of local planning remains politically determined. So we've got a lot more tools, and the Department of Urban Planning here is on the forefront of building some of those tools, and we're going to do better planning as a result. But as long as the political motivation is to serve the local interests, we're going to continue to have these problems. And you know, we're not going to get much help from the current administration. Right? I don't have to say more about that. So, from smart growth to sustainable cities, the evolution of sustainable cities. The concept of sustainability is not a new one. We've known about sustainable forestry, sustainable fishing, sustainable agriculture for a very long time. The idea being that you've got to manage in a way that it perpetuates the ability to use the resource. Sustainable development, and the Brundtland Commission talked about meeting the needs of future generations without meeting the needs of the current generation without compromising the ability of future generations. And the plan for Seattle in 2035, adopted in the early 90s, promulgated these 3 E's, environment, economy, and equity, which is how sustainable development has become manifest in sustainability plans at the local level. All right, so how do we go from smart growth to sustainable development? So I would argue, and I'm trying to make the case here, that the principles of smart growth remain valid, and the pursuit of sustainable cities require not only reliance on the smart growth principles, but we're going to have to address new challenges and opportunities. These include climate and energy, transportation technology, workforce, public health, and smart cities. These were not on the radar back in the early 1990s when smart growth was first being developed. So first I want to say that urban form still matters if we're addressing climate change, particularly in the residential sector. What this bar graph illustrates is the type of residential energy use in different types of development, from the suburban average on the far left to the urban multifamily on the far right, the green. And again, what this shows you, without going into too much detail, on how much electricity, heating, and transportation energy is used, that as you go from the very suburban average type of development to the very green multifamily development in the urban core, you use less energy. So promulgating and following the principles of smart growth will help a lot on the climate front. I call this the transportation revolution. The adoption of connected, autonomous, electric, and shared vehicles will challenge our knowledge of the transportation land use connection. There was a recent paper in the Journal of the American Planning Association that addressed the relationship between driving and land use. And the response that I was asked to write was titled, "A Careful Look in the Rear View Mirror." Right? And the reason I say that is because these technologies are going to revolutionize this relationship, right? As I'll show you later on. So decisions about where and how we accommodate these new technologies are really going to be critically important if we're going to promote sustainability. The next issue is the salience of spatial equity. I don't know if some of you saw Monday, there was a big splash all around the country with a new release of Raj Chetty's work, which shows how important place is with respect to social mobility, right? That people who live in poor environments are not going to get the same opportunities for social mobility as people who live in rich environments. A lot of opportunity mapping has gone on. We've done a lot of this mapping ourselves. If you think about it locally, do you really believe that people who live north of Bradley and Champaign-Urbana have the same opportunities as the people who live south of Windsor? It just isn't true, right? And this needs to become part of the sustainability agenda. So we know this to be true. We don't exactly know why, actually. Right? Why is it? Is it because of lack of poverty? Is it because of poor education? Is it because of lack of access to good schools? Is it because of a social environment? There's a lot of work being done in the social sciences about how these neighborhoods manifest themselves, but we do know they exist. There's a renewed focus on human capital. I'm not going to say a whole lot about this, but we're much more concerned about human health now in the planning profession than we used to be, and the need for workforce development. If we really care about this equity agenda, we need to make sure that there are not only workforce development training opportunities, but they are located in places where low-income people can have access to them. And last, on this score, the potential of smart cities. We're trying to move into the smart cities space. Smart cities, like smart growth, is a kind of an ill-defined thing. Everybody has their own definition, but generally this has to do with the use of computer sensors and data analytics and real-time responses. And I think this is going to tremendously revolutionize our ability to manage cities on the environmental front, on the health front, on the transportation front, and on the social service front. There's tremendous opportunity here. So I want to talk a little bit about some work we're doing at the University of Maryland in a project we call Presto, and it uses what we call scenario analysis. This is work that I've been doing, again, with a lot of interaction among folks still here at the Department of Urban Planning at the University of Illinois. So the idea about scenario analysis is that we have a lot of uncertainty. We don't know how fast we're going to adopt autonomous vehicles. We don't know what's going to happen to fuel prices. We don't know what's going to happen to immigration rates. So rather than try to pretend that we can forecast those things, let's take that uncertainty explicitly into account and plan as though we recognize that uncertainty and plan accordingly. So this work is being done in the Baltimore-Washington metropolitan area. Our modeling region actually includes the entire state of Maryland and that big ring around this area. Baltimore-Washington metropolitan area is a big metropolitan area and extremely diverse. It's the home of Freddie Gray. Right? It's also the home of some very wealthy people in Montgomery County. So to address this, we've built a lot of models and integrated them using what we call loosely coupled modeling techniques with Python wrappers. So it starts with an econometric model, which feeds a land use model, which feeds a transportation model, which feeds environmental impact models, which feeds a health model. So I'm not going to go into any detail here except to say that this is a very sophisticated set of models that includes the latest modeling tools used by organizations within the Baltimore metropolitan area. And our advancement has been largely to connect these in a way that we can explore sustainability in a much greater and broader fashion than we have been in the past. So the first thing that needs to be done is you need to construct scenarios. How might the future play out, right, in the Baltimore-Washington region? We got a whole bunch of smart people in the room. Arnab was one of them, right? And we asked them to identify what are the big things that are really going to affect this region, and which of those things are uncertain. So if we know something is going to affect the region, we need to build that in every scenario. We know climate change is going to happen, so we build that into every one of the scenarios. We don't know how fast autonomous vehicles are going to be adopted. We don't know how fast fuel prices are going to be rising. So let's construct scenarios where fuel prices rise quickly and one where fuel prices do not rise quickly. One in which autonomous vehicles are adopted rapidly and one in which they're not. So construct scenarios in which the future may play out in different ways and make plans that are contingent upon those alternative scenarios. So with the help of some grad students who gave our scenarios clever names after movies, the first scenario is called Revenge of the Nerds. Right? This is a scenario with the rapid adoption of autonomous vehicles. Right? So a lot of autonomous vehicles, self-driving cars. We assume low fuel costs in this scenario. We assume somewhat of a weakening in the regulatory environment, and again, this rapid adoption of technology. We don't assume any major investments in the road system here, but we assume that these road systems are now increasing in capacity substantially because of these autonomous vehicles. So the autonomous vehicles, because they can drive next to each other much more closely, the road system can handle a whole lot more of them. The second scenario is called Blue Planet. This is a high fuel cost scenario with a rapid adoption of technology, but with electric vehicles, right? Not autonomous vehicles. And substantial investments in transit. So you can see the new transit network that we have constructed for the Baltimore-Washington area. The third scenario is Freeforall. Right, here's a low-cost scenario with very little government intervention. We basically blow out the land use controls in this case, no technology to save us in this case, and we built outer beltways around the Baltimore and Washington region and a new bridge to the Eastern Shore. Now, this is heresy in our region, right? We can pull this off because we are in the ivory tower, right? But we wanted to see what difference would this make. And the last one is call it the Oasis. Those of you in my generation would call this the limits to growth scenario, right? So here's one with really high fuel costs, a lot of government regulation, and minimum technological intervention, mostly in the non-automobile sector. So we constructed these narratives about the way the future may play out in the Baltimore-Washington region, and we had to then input variables into that modeling suite that essentially carried those narratives into that modeling suite. So a lot of inputs, I'm not going to go through any of them, but essentially the key drivers here were the location and rate of employment growth, the vehicle characteristics, whether it's autonomous vehicles or not autonomous vehicles, and their efficiency and cost, the transportation investments, whether we build in roads or we build in transit, the land use controls, whether we maintain strict control over land use or whether we blow them out, and building efficiency, the rate at which we retrofit and adopt solar energy. So very quickly on results, I'm going to summarize these quickly. You don't care about the Baltimore-Washington area, perhaps, but you can see from this Revenge of the Nerds scenarios that all the purple lines go to the right for the most part, except one, which is transit ridership, which goes to the left. So under this autonomous vehicle, low fuel cost strategy, we get a lot more driving, we get a lot more greenhouse gases, we get a lot more farm and land consumption, and we get a falling off the table of transit. This is not a beautiful picture, right, for our region. On the Blue Planet scenario, you can see it's somewhat mixed. Blue Planet is the one where we have much more compact development. I should back up a second here for a second. Notice in the Revenge of the Nerds, the development was all around the periphery, right, not in central Baltimore or in central Washington. Blue Planet is a much more compact development pattern. We get tremendous improvements in greenhouse gas emissions, tremendous blue lines to the left on that side. We get increases in transit ridership, and we get increases in nutrient loads, mostly because we're protecting the farmland. It's a dirty little truth in our region that if you protect farmland, you get more nutrient loadings off the farmland than you do in urban development. If we look at Freeforall, right, we get a tremendous fall in transit ridership, right, because of the cheap gas prices. And we built all these additional roads. We get new development patterns all around the new beltways that we are building in the Baltimore-Washington areas. And we get reductions in the nutrient loading and somewhat of a reduction in vehicle hours traveled because of the increased lane capacity that we've built. And finally, last, call it the Oasis. This is the limits to growth strategy. And all the green lines are going to the left here, right? This is all going in a good direction, except the one to the right, which is transit ridership, which is also going in a good direction. So we try to characterize these scenarios in what we call sustainability footprints, right? You can't see what's on these axes here, but essentially each axis here is an element of either transportation or land use or water and so forth. The bigger the image, the less sustainable, the larger the footprint. This is a highly imperfect measure, but it tries to convey, in a sense, how you can capture sustainability and estimate a footprint in a coherent way. So each of the scenarios you can see points out to some different direction. Some of them have benefits in one direction, some of them have benefits in another. You can see that last, call it the Oasis, which is the most sustainable scenario, however, scores absolutely worst on the equity scenario. So housing prices, transportation costs, and so forth, particularly the burdens on low-income people, are the worst in that scenario. So what have we learned from this exercise? First, changes in transportation technologies, land use policies, energy prices could have profound impacts. Right? The world could be quite different. Right? We're concerned about sustainability, and the message that I want to give to you is we can do something about it because these policy levers are really important, and we have the opportunity to do something about it. The future is not given, but is the outcome partly of exogenous forces, but also of policy decisions. And some of the policy decisions are robust, which means they are policy decisions that you must adopt regardless of the way the world turns, and some of them are contingent. Investing in transit makes very little sense in a low-cost autonomous vehicle scenario. It makes great sense in a high-cost electric vehicle scenario. So as I said before, the rapid adoption of autonomous vehicles has the potential to increase driving, foster more dispersed development pattern, and cause more air and water pollution. This is a threat to sustainability of or metropolitan areas. It's going to be cool to be able to drive to work with your feet up on your steering wheel, right? But the implications of that are something that planners really need to think about carefully. Land development regulations have a strong effect on development patterns and tend to deflect growth from the inner suburbs. We are part of the problem. Right? The land use controls into central cities, which are excluding low-income people from living in the suburbs, is a big problem. And the rapid adoption of electric vehicles is the key to achieving greenhouse gas targets. We're working with the Climate Commission in Maryland, and we keep telling them electric vehicles, if you're going to make progress in the transportation system, is really the key to making progress on our greenhouse gas targets. Future transit ridership is really unpredictable and tenuous. I'd be hesitant to invest a lot in transit, particularly in suburban areas. Not all preservation is alike. It's much more helpful to protect forest land than it is farmland from a nutrient loading perspective in particular. Growth containment at the local scale looks like NIMBYism at the regional scale. Montgomery County is very famous for its wedges and corridors plan, which means it protects the green belt around the northern part of Montgomery County, and it's well known for that. That's great for Montgomery County, and I love it because I live in Montgomery County. But from a regional perspective, that's really not so great, that it deflects all the growth north to Frederick County. And so we have now longer commuting patterns because of that deflection. So we need to think about this regionally. Trade-offs are inevitable. Right? All the objectives of smart growth and sustainability are going to be difficult to achieve at once, and we need to carefully consider the trade-offs. So a few concluding comments. First, the principles of smart growth remain valid today, though our success with implementation has been limited. I think the ideas that we promulgated back in the early 1990s were right. Right? We want more compact, mixed-use, transit-friendly, preserving farmland. That's all good. Right? It's all good for the protection of the environment and for vibrant cities. But we've done a terrible job of implementing these ideas. It just isn't happening very quickly. Creating sustainable cities, however, will require us to go beyond smart growth, address new, more systemic challenges. Harnessing the power of technological change for good will be critical. And if we don't channel that technological change on the smart cities front and on the autonomous vehicles front, it's going to be detrimental rather than beneficial. In these uncertain times, model-based scenario analysis represents a useful tool to help us explore and design more sustainable cities. Right? We can't continue to plan as though we know what the future is going to be and plan for it. We have to recognize the uncertainty and respond accordingly. And there's no time to waste. Thank you.
Sure, Dr. Knapp is happy to entertain some questions.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's no general way to answer that question, right? It depends. I mean, this is part of the problem is the zoning laws vary from place to place to place. I mean, it is in fact the case that in relatively high density places, there are grocery stores, right, with residential uses above them, right? So that can happen. I don't know what the Champaign or Urbana zoning code would allow that. I kind of doubt it, but I probably shouldn't say that. What specifically, how can I answer your question? I think you get tremendous resistance. I think zoning laws are a major impediment to achieving the things that we want to achieve. Now, it's going to vary place by place, and I think we're making progress on that front and redesigning the zoning codes in Montgomery County and Prince George's County, and I don't know when last did a zoning rewrite here, but it remains a major impediment. Yeah.
So one of the factors that I didn't see really included in your analysis is the impact of federal policy on infrastructure investment And during the Obama administration, there was a change. Most people weren't quite aware of it, but there was a change in what we were measuring in the required long-range transportation plans that every city community has to do to get federal transportation dollars, that required measuring things like greenhouse gas emissions, and you had to take a look at that in terms of deciding where you were going to invest transportation infrastructure dollars. Of course, the application of that varied dramatically based on DOT policies, but it nevertheless began that process of taking that measurement in relation to those investments. And in this community, we did look at that. We have had a lot more infill and redevelopment. We have changed in large part infrastructure investment dollars where they were directed. And so it does have an impact, and I was curious about your thoughts about that.
I think you've done a terrific job. I'm not sure how to respond. I mean, the change in policy at the federal level can't be overstated, right? I mean, we had progressive policy with respect to climate and transportation and fair housing, right? And all of that has been eliminated.
Well, the greenhouse gas measurement requirement is still there.
Okay.
It's just that you don't have to
Just so you don't have to do it.
Right.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions? Yeah.
In your experience, have you had any situations where there's been cities that are in decay and they've actually been able to revitalize them? And if so, what was the primary driver for that, and where was the funding?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a challenge, right? I mean, we have cities that have been decaying for a very long time, and I think we're making some successes at the fringe. My sense of, I mean, the place I know best is Baltimore, right? And Baltimore's certainly in need of massive revitalization. There is revitalization happening in certain fringes of the city, and I think that's the best strategy, is to try to take it piece by piece. I think that's probably what's happening in Detroit and other places as well. And an omnibus hope that you're going to try to, fix the place all at once is probably not a good strategy. But to move incrementally, the way we moved incrementally into the suburban, into the greenfields, I think we need to move incrementally back into the city. And I think that's the key to success in these places. Yeah.
You indicated on your slides that urban redevelopment is much more costly due to code upgrading and just costs of taking old buildings and making them better.
Yeah.
And you also indicated that financial incentives have been disappointing.
Yeah.
Are you a proponent of financial incentives?
Sure. I'm an economist. I got to believe in financial incentives.
And do you also believe that it's cost effective over time?
Well, I'm not sure what sort of trap
Well,
you're
I would say, I would say an analysis of that would be recapturing the dollars you put into the incentive through additional property tax increases because of the property being increased in value from a blighted property at worst to an upgraded property.
Are you a developer?
Somewhat, yes.
Okay. Well, so let me just ask you, right? Is it more expensive to develop on a greenfield or in a brownfield?
Not yes, hell yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Much more
Right.
expensive.
And so would incentives to develop in the brownfield help you? Probably, right? Would a little incentive help, or you need a big incentive? You would like a,
I'm just asking about the government
Yes.
payout.
Yeah.
Will they recapture it, and is it cost effective to them, to the government?
it could be. Yeah, it could be. It depends on the situation, of course. Yeah. Yeah.
So on the question of federal policy, I'm pretty sure that in the Tax Act, they enacted a provision that you could essentially defer your capital gains if you reinvest in development in the inner city.
Part of
I think they
opportunity
just
zone.
issued regulations on that, and I'm already starting to see people raising money on that. That seems like potentially a very positive development, because a lot of people are trying to find deals in the inner city to invest in.
Yeah, that's a good point, and that's what these opportunity zones are all about as well, to try to create tax benefits to investing in places with low opportunity. I hope I didn't come across as saying I don't believe in incentives, right? But sometimes they aren't strong enough, right? And the ultimate incentive is if you don't do this, you go to jail, right? I mean, that's a regulation, right? And sometimes you have to do regulations. I'm sorry, right? Sometimes the incentives just aren't good enough to get the kind of development pattern that you want, and you need to impose regulations in that case. So again, I don't belabor the point, but Oregon has had tremendous success with its urban growth containment because it regulates land use and says you cannot develop outside this boundary. Maryland says you can develop outside the boundary, but the state isn't going to pay for the infrastructure. Okay, that's fine. The state's not going to, there's an incentive to develop it, but it just hasn't had enough effect, right? The developers will pay it themselves. It's such a profitable thing to do, right, that the incentive just isn't strong enough. I support incentives, right, but they just need to be of significant size. In some cases, they need to be backed up by regulation. That's why that was your question. Rolf Pendo.
Well, thanks very much for being here tonight, Garrett. Garrett, it's great to see you. One of the pieces of work that you haven't talked about much that I think would be interesting to hear about is your work with public engagement around opportunity measurement and conversations in Baltimore between people who live in low-income, mostly African-American neighborhoods in the city, folks who live in the suburbs. So can you talk a little bit about that kind of scenario and public process and how you think that relates to maybe some of the challenges of overcoming political resistance, if you think it does, to changing the way that we make decisions about land use and community development?
I knew you were going to ask me a question that I couldn't answer. Well, that's a tough question, right? So we have done a lot of work in Baltimore, and we've done it in very low-income communities because we've seen a lot of opportunity mapping, as you well know, right? Everybody's doing it, and usually the opportunity mapping, I call it McCargian overlays with social data, right? Which is overlaying the educational data with the income data and the housing data, and usually those are built on data that are available, right? So our strategy in Baltimore is to actually go in and talk to people. Right? What are your impediments to opportunity? How can we increase your access to opportunity, which the city just hasn't done, right? And so I think if you get a better sense of what opportunity is from the people who need opportunity, I hope this is the answer to your question. And opportunity isn't the same to everybody, right? I mean, it's certainly not the same to an elderly person who's invalid as a young parent with children, right? So opportunity doesn't mean the same to everyone, and the nuance of that, I don't think has quite been picked up yet. In the back.
You mentioned Portland and Seattle as positive case studies for sustainable cities. What would be an example of a negative case study, or what's a major city right now that's going the wrong direction? Because I think you can teach a lot of things from the negative side as well as the positive side.
Yeah, but it's impolitic to sort of stand before an audience and identify places you think are really stinking it up. So I'm going to refuse to answer that question.
Maybe we can talk privately.
All right, sure. We good?